Hi, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh. This is Leslie again. I am doing another video today. I hope to keep it relatively short, 30-40 minutes, but definitely not more than 1 hour. I think that should be the maximum limit. One reason for that, of course, is that people don't like long videos, and neither do I. And secondly, people's attention span also is limited. And anyway, you can always do a follow-up video if you haven't managed to cover whatever you wanted to cover. So now in this particular video, I would like to address one question. The question is, does the Sunnah judge the Quran? Now, this principle that the Sunnah judges the Quran is pretty central to traditional exegesis or tafsir. I think that practically all the traditional exegesis or tafsir of the Quran is based on the principle that if we want to get a good understanding of the Quran, we need to see the Quran through the lens of tradition. In other words, we need to read the Quran in light of, so to speak, the Hadith or the Sunnah. I'm using the term Sunnah here in Al-Shafi's sense because he did not differentiate between Sunnah and the Hadith. To him, the two meant the same thing. Of course, a case could be made that they are not the same thing, as in fact I have tried in a small book called Sunnah and the Hadith, What Are the Differences? Very briefly, I think the Sunnah, correctly understood, is the way of the Prophet, and this way of the Prophet was to, correctly understood, was to follow the Quran. However, the traditional understanding of the Sunnah is that we find out about the way of the Prophet, the Sunnah of the Prophet, from the books of the Hadith, of which we have altogether six: Sahih Muslim, Sahih Bukhari, and four others. So that following the Sunnah in a traditional mainstream sense of the term means to follow these books of Ahadith. So now, of course, that raises a problem in itself because clearly the Prophet himself never followed any of those six books of the Ahadith. Actually, he didn't even know about them, and he couldn't have known about them because the people who collected these six books of Ahadith lived centuries after him. So, how did this happen that the Sunnah of the Prophet was identified with or associated with following books of Hadith that were compiled, recorded, and compiled more than 200 years after his passing? But that is not the main question I want to focus on here. It's good to keep it in mind that this issue is there and it needs attention. Perhaps we could do another video on this question another time. But here, as I mentioned, I would like to focus on the question, does the Sunnah judge the Quran? And the Arabic term for the expression that the Sunnah judges the Quran is as-Sunnah Qadiya ala Quran. So now perhaps I could share that I first heard this expression approximately 20 years ago in 2002, when during the first year of my work at the International Science University, Islamic Science University of Malaysia, where I stayed for 5 years as a lecturer. I lectured mostly English. Shakespeare's Othello, for example, from the perspective of Islam. English for special purposes, basic standard English, and I even coordinated the English program for a year. And I have done a bit of editing there as well, and I think I managed to write two papers. One was on morality in the West. Another one was on the question of secularism and Islam. There may have been a third one, However, my academic output in terms of writing in terms of writing was fairly minor, probably due to the fact that I was, as it were, the new kid on the block, relatively new to Islam, although to academic Islam, I should say. Although I have converted, to Islam, I think it was nearly 10 years earlier, back in Canada, in Vancouver, when I was marrying my wife, who happens to be a Muslim, and I knew that in order to marry her, I myself had to be a Muslim. So I have to confess that my initial conversion to Islam was rather perfunctory. However, a few years later, there was a, shall I call it, a deeper realization, and I realized that there's more to being a Muslim than I had thought until then, until that time. I think the difference between the two conversions that I experienced roughly corresponds to the difference between becoming a Muslim, which you do by saying the Shahada, and and becoming a mu'min, a believer, which happens, I think, when the iman or the faith does not remain, so to speak, on the surface and in a form of rituals mainly, but penetrates deeper into the soul and is exhibited, manifested more and more in the thinking and the actions of the person involved. Anyway, I don't mean this video to be a sort of a story of personal memories. However, I perhaps could mention one interesting event that happened after, basically on the same day of the day of my conversion. A young fellow from Pakistan, whose name escapes me, but he was a very happy-go-lucky fellow, and he's the one who kind of facilitated my conversion. He also gave me a copy of Al Quran, translated by Abdullah Yusuf Ali, the one with the transliteration in it, and which I have read many times, along with a few other translations of also. And I remember that on a day that after my conversions, he took me to a fair where there was a big hall, and all these booksellers were selling their books on Islam and what have you. So I kind of gravitated towards one table, and I saw a book of the Hadith there. It was the famous book called the 40 Hadith, I think by Imam Nawawi. So I reached for this book. I already had the Quran in my right hand, so I reached for this book and I purchased it. And what surprised me was the look on the face of my companion, the Imam, the young man from Pakistan. He suddenly looked very, what's the right word, dismayed, even a little depressed when he saw me buying this book of the Hadith, and I began to wonder why is he looking so disappointed, as if he were disappointed in me that I bought this book of the Hadith. So I cannot explain exactly why that happened, but perhaps he, like not a few other Muslims today, prefers to focus on the Quran, and perhaps he saw me reaching out for this book of Hadith as a sort of distraction from what should be my main focus, which was the Quran. I have to admit that years later, I myself came, or are coming to, maybe I should use this tense, to a comparable conclusion, because I am also now inclining to the view that we Muslims, or the Muslim community at large, has paid far too much attention to the Hadith and not enough attention to the Quran. And I have even attempted to explain this phenomenon in my first book on the subject, and the book is currently available already on Amazon.com, along with another 81 or so titles, which I have written since then. And the name of the book is How Tradition Eclipsed Revelation. And it is an attempt to explain what happened, how it happened, and why it happened, and what can be done about it. So now this, to come back to the main topic today, this issue of the eclipse, or the overshadowing, if you like, of the Quran, of revelation by the Hadith or tradition, is actually implied also in the very expression that I have mentioned as the subject of this video. It is reflected in a statement that the the hadith or the Sunnah judges the Quran or the Revelation. Now, you see, I say that because a judge is someone who is always in a position of superiority to the one who is being judged. So, if there's an accused in a court of law, he will, of course, have to submit to the judgment of the judge and act accordingly. So something similar is taking place when we say that the Sunnah or the Hadith judge the Quran. We are basically subordinating the Word of God to the man-made narrations, in other words, the words of men. Now, my question, very simply, is this the right way to proceed? I mean, how can we say that the words of human being are going to judge the words of God when God himself tells us, as we Muslims believe in Al-Quran, that he is the judge and we will be judged by him, his servants will be judged by him on the day of accountability, or Yawmul Qiyamah, for our deeds or misdeeds as the case may be. So I was very surprised that the Muslim community adopted this manhaj, this approach to the understanding of the Quran. And that also reminds me of an incident which I, experienced in the very same first year of the university, when I heard a colleague of mine say those very same words. And he basically said to me and three or four other chaps who were we were all together at the time, and he said that he mentioned this dictum, and he said that after all the Sunnah judges the Quran. So that's the first time I heard that expression, and I was quite taken aback by it, and I really, quite frankly, didn't know quite what to do. Something in me was rebelling against this statement, and I wanted me to say something back to him, or to reply to him, or to express reservations of some kind, or perhaps even disagreement. But there was another voice that was telling me, so to speak, but you better be keep quiet, because first of all, you are quote unquote the new kid on the block. You are just in a process of becoming a Muslim, and these fellows here have been Muslims all their lives. They probably know better than you. And finally, the deciding factor came when this thought occurred to me that, after all, maybe you did not hear him correctly. And if you did not hear him correctly and now you're going to speak up, you will just make a fool out of yourself. So, of course, I didn't want to make a fool out of myself, so I remained quiet. However, later on, as time went by, I realized that this statement that he expressed, that the Sunnah judges the Quran, is actually quite widespread in traditional Islam, and it is an accepted part of the so-called manhaj or methodology of understanding the Quran. And I also came to realize that I was not alone in having reservations about this fundamental presupposition of, or in the traditional methodology of the exegesis of the Quran, or tafsir as we call it. I realize there are other people who have expressed concerns about this. For example, there's a group in Egypt who claimed that basically to adopt this principle is to reverse the proper relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah, because the Quran is the first and foremost source of the Sharia, and the Sunnah comes only in the second place. That is even stated in Al-Shafi's, ranking of the sources of the Sharia, which are, as I mentioned, Quran in the first place, Sunnah in the second place, Ijma, or the consensus of the scholars, in the third place, and ijtihad, or the individual juristic effort of the jurist, in the fourth place. Now, there are four others. Perhaps I don't need to go into them, or perhaps I can just mention them briefly. The four other sources of Islamic law include istisla, or the considerations of public interest, istihsan, or the juristic preference. In other words, the jurist will choose one or another alternative among several alternatives, depending on which of the alternatives is closest in line with justice. Then, in the seventh place, there is also custom or urf, which is also taken to be a source of the Sharia. And finally, we have the concept of blocking the means, or saddu zaraya, which also is another source of the law. And this one calls for declaring those acts illegal or unlawful, which while in themselves not illegal, could lead to other acts which are illegal. Hence, these acts which are considered the means to an illegal act are also declared as illegal. For example, being alone with a woman who is not my relative in a secluded place has been identified as a crime of close proximity, and it has been identified as a crime because it allegedly could lead to an act that is specified, identified as a crime in the Quran, and that is the crime of zina or adultery. So these people in Egypt were basically pointing out that the methodology of understanding the Quran, which says that we need to understand revelation in light of tradition, that we have to judge the Quran by the Sunnah, they say, and I think they are right in doing this, that this methodology reverses the proper relationship between the Quran and the Sunnah. And this idea that the relationship between Quran and Sunnah has not been properly articulated in traditional Islam has been reiterated by none other than Tajabir al-Wani, who is known as a neo-traditionalist scholar. He was, I think, a graduate of PhD of Al-Azhar University. I think he was originally of an Iraqi background, and he later also became the chairman of the Triple IT Institute, the International Institute of Islamic Thought in Virginia, USA. So he also explained, expressed some concerns about the way this relationship between Quran and Sunnah has been understood, or rather misunderstood, and in fact he wrote a whole book about it. The book was published in 2017. It's available online, free in PDF format. It was published by the Triple IT organization, and the name of the book is Reviving the Balance. I think he is referring to the balance between Quran and Sunnah. So clearly there is concern about the proper understanding of the relationship between Quran and Sunnah, even among, if not traditional, then certainly neo-traditional scholars, Sunni scholars. This is not something that is coming only from people that are perceived as Quran-centric, or even identified as Quranist, but we can talk about the distinction between the two perhaps some other time. But yes, indeed, the Quran-centric people have expressed this concern also, that there has been too much focus on the Hadith and too little focus on the Quran. So now, where do we go from here? And how did this discussion arise in the first place? Well, actually, this notion that the Sunnah judges the Quran is part of four steps or four developments which, in my own research over the years, I have identified as basically leading to, or kind of expressing a process. This notion, let me put it this way, that the Sunnah judges the Quran is part of four, what I have called, am calling, aberrations in Islamic methodology. And these four steps actually include, very briefly, the repression of reason, or its subordination to tradition. That is that I have referred to as the first major aberration in Islamic thought. which led to the second problem or problematic development in Muslim Islamic thought on the subject of the relationship between the sources of the law and the sources of Islam. And this second stage, if you like, was the further elevation of tradition, this time to a level of equality with revelation. So this transpired when the hadiths were declared to be wahi or revelation, and according to some people, even equal to the Quran. There is a quite well known hadith which pretty much says as much. And this hadith has been quoted by Ibn Baz, a Saudi cleric, on his website, and it has also been quoted by the man I mentioned earlier, Tahaj al-Wani, in a book that I have also mentioned already. And the hadith basically says that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be on him, allegedly said that, I quote, "I was given two things, the Quran and something equal to it," and then in brackets the word hadith is mentioned, end of quote. So now both versions of the hadith found on Ibn Baz's website and also in Taj al-Wani's book use the word equal. Now the Arabic term in the hadith is mithlihi, which can also be translated as something similar. But it can also be rendered as equal, and I suppose that is the choice these two gentlemen made, the ones I mentioned, and so they are translating the expression mithlihi as equal. But even if you were to translate it as something similar, the idea that there's anything similar to the Quran in other narratives is problematic because, from a Quranic perspective, it is problematic because, after all, as we know, those of us who have read the Quran and have done it with a reasonable degree of care, the Quran informs us that it is inimitable and even challenges us if we do not believe that this Quran is from God Himself. The Quran challenges us to produce at least 10 surahs like the ones that we find in the Quran, and if we cannot produce 10 surahs, it challenges us to produce at least one. And so far, to my knowledge, very few people rose to the challenge, although we do have 6 authors who appear to have taken up the challenge. And I am referring to Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Nasai, Ibn Majah, and Abu Dawud. These 6 gentlemen, it appears, took up the challenge and actually produced or assembled narrations that they, well, perhaps not they, but others after them. I'm not sure whether they themselves claimed equality of what they collected with the Quran, but certainly there are others who came after them who claimed that these 6 additional books are, similar to the Quran, and they are similar to the Quran because they too are what is called wahi or revelation or inspiration. The idea that the Hadith books constitute a second revelation is quite widespread in traditional exegesis. And in Arabic, the term for this duality of revelation is wahi ain, and in English we render this term as the concept of dual revelation. In other words, the concept of dual revelation teaches that the Prophet, peace be on him, was given basically 2 revelations, not just the Quran, which the supporters of the second revelation call Wahi Zahir, but also a second form or mode of revelation, which the supporters of the traditions, the idea that the traditions are also a form of revelation, and they call this second mode of revelation as Wahi Batin, or hidden or concealed revelation, although some ulama have rendered the word Batim, I think somewhat incorrectly, as meaning internal, but I think if you look into the dictionary, the word batin, the word hidden or concealed is closer to the word batin than the word internal. Perhaps the reason why some ulama have decided to render the expression wahi batin as internal revelation is the The fact that when you think about the term hidden revelation or concealed revelation, you realize that this term is actually an oxymoron, or what we call a contradictory expression, because it is telling us that there is something which is revealed and hidden at the same time. So, how can anything be both hidden and apparent or revealed at the same time? Difficult. So we can understand why some of the ulama would prefer to use the word internal revelation to refer to the hadith in this way, rather than referring to it as hidden or concealed revelation. However, the concept of the second revelation is problematic for another reason, which is that, or perhaps this should be the first reason, which is that there is no basis to believe that there is a second revelation in the Quran. The Quran gives no indication that there is a second revelation. There is no information in the Quran to inform us that after the completion of the Quran, there would be 6 more books of revelation coming our way, which is in fact what happened. So, in fact, the Prophet Muhammad is referred to as the seal of the prophets, and would not expect any additional books of revelations to be revealed after him. Yet, according to the traditional ulama, we are expected to believe that this was actually not the case, that actually there were 6 additional books of revelation that, if they were not compiled, the 200 years after the demise of the Prophet, some of them would claim that these were already there, so to speak. It's just that they have not been recorded and compiled into separate anthologies of traditions. Now, there are also further problems with this, which is that it is well known from the traditions themselves that the Prophet himself, peace be on him, prohibited recording and narrating his own traditions. So the people that assembled these traditions or books of traditions, in fact, acted contrary to the prohibition that the Prophet himself gave. And we can take it a step further and alert our viewers also to the fact that not only the Prophet, but even Allah Ta'ala himself has forbidden or prohibited adding to revelation, and this is found in Surah 69 in verses 44 to 46, where Allah warns the Prophet, in fact, not to add anything to revelation in Allah's name, and if he were to do that, Allah says he would take him, the Prophet, by the right hand and cut off his artery. Now, in all fairness to the Prophet, we can observe and should observe that he never did that. He never added anything of his own to the revelation of the Quran. It was some of the people that came after him. They are the ones who did that. Yet sometimes we hear from the very same people that insist on this duality of revelation, and how do I put this? Very often we hear the very same people who support the traditions as a second form of revelation. They are reminding us that we should obey Allah and the Prophet as stated in the Quran. Yet here we can ask them in all fairness, well, have you obeyed Allah and the Prophet when you have collected, compiled, and narrated all these narrations of the ahadith, and you have done it in defiance of the twin prohibitions, first by Allah himself and secondly by the Prophet himself? So how would our friends respond to this concern? Well, perhaps we can return to this question at another time. However, I would like to return to the main point once again of this video, which is, does the Sunnah judge the Quran? So I would say the short answer is that it does not, but rather the Quran judges the Sunnah. So this traditional method of tafsir has actually turned things upside down, and this relationship has to be set right, and we need to place Quran once again above the tradition. Even Taj Aberrations, in one of his writings, noted that we need to come up with a methodology which will allow us to subordinate all tradition to revelation, rather than allowing the tradition to subordinate revelation. So, in other words, what I'm suggesting is that we have a problem, a serious problem in the traditional methodology of tafsir or the interpretation of the Quran, and this requires attention. And I could perhaps add also that another scholar, his name is Abdul Hamid Abu Sulaiman, he was a friend of Taj Abirawani, and he was also the second rector of the International Islamic University here in Malaysia, and he also was active in the Triple IT Institute in the United States. And Abu Sulaiman also expressed concerns about the methodology, traditional methodology, and called for a reform of the methodology. He did not say that we need to reform Islam. No, he said we need to reform the methodology by which we understand, the Islam. I think we and specifically, I would, emphasize that even though he put it in fairly broad terms, I think we need to review the methodology of understanding the Quran in particular, and we need to review particularly this idea that the Sunnah judges the Quran, which basically subordinates the words of God to the words of men, and I think that is not quite the right way to proceed. So, having said all that, perhaps I could come to a conclusion here and just recap by perhaps also recalling one statement by Taha Birawani in relation to the traditional methodology. And he basically said the traditional approach, he calls it a traditional approach, has failed to prevent the Muslim Ummah from falling into backwardness. Once again, I believe that quote is in a book I mentioned. However, perhaps I need to. I think it was in that book, but you may find fuller, treatments of this topic in some of my writings, and of course also in my books on Amazon. My academic writings are also found on academia under my legal name, Leslie Terebesi. There are about 200 over papers and a few books. The books that have been published on Amazon appear on this academic website only in an abridged form, I have to mention. And the same material is also available on ResearchGate, another academic website. But this time, the books, my work is listed under my Muslim name, which is Abdul Karim Abdullah. So once again, people who would like to, get further detail on and information on this question, perhaps can consult additional work, some of the work I have done in this area. However, I would also like to recommend a couple of additional books. One written by Daniel Brown, an excellent book. It's called Rethinking Tradition in Islam. And there's another book which I also recommend, that is a book by called Quran, Morality and Critical Reason, written by Muhammad Shahrur, published in Damascus, Syria in 2007. In addition, perhaps I could mention one other book, that is a book by Omar Chapra, and it's called The Decline of the Muslim Civilization. So there are a number of worthwhile efforts going on by Muslims and who are trying to analyze, as it were, what precisely went wrong in Muslim intellectual history and what can we do to make it right. And the point I was trying to make in this particular video was that one of the things that went wrong or caused things to go wrong was the adoption of this problematic methodology of interpreting the Quran, which basically subordinates the Quran, the words of God, to the narrations of men or human beings. In the process, what we have seen was a sort of a distortion, I think, of the real teaching of the Quran, and perhaps I can go into some of these distortions in some other videos. I'm not sure whether this is the right time to say anything more on this issue, or maybe we should just wrap it up here. I think we can just wrap it up here, but with the proviso that, inshallah, this question or this line of questioning, perhaps we can take up again in the following video, where we could perhaps look at the consequences of the adoption of this methodology of understanding the Quran. And among those consequences, I think we will see will be a sort of transformation of our knowledge of revelation, a transformation of our knowledge of Islam as a religion of peace, as indeed articulated by the Quran, into something somewhat different, and I have called it a religion of war, as it is articulated by some of the ulama who have utilized the doctrine of abrogation of the peace verses by the verse of the sword to basically strip the Quran of its teaching of peace and replace it with another teaching, the teaching of war, which is based partly on their own ideas, such as the invention of the doctrine of jihad al-talab, or aggressive jihad, and the notion that it is not only permissible but even required to wage this jihad al-talab, which they refer to as the sixth pillar of Islam. According to them, the ulama that supported the notion of jihad al-talab, this is a requirement that has to be fulfilled once a year and every year. And this transformation was also facilitated to some extent by the adoption of certain problematic traditions, such as the tradition according to which says that, I quote, God bless Prophet Muhammad, who was sent with the sword as a mercy to mankind. Mercy to the worlds. So now this tradition sounds very similar to a Quranic verse which says, وَمَا أَرْسَلْنَاكَ إِلَّا رَحْمَةً لِلْعَالَمِينَ, and that means we have not sent you but as a mercy to the worlds. Now notice the difference between the hadith and a Quranic verse. There's a huge difference. The difference is the word sword. The Quran makes no mention of the word sword, but the hadith does. So what do you make of that? I'll let you draw your own conclusion. But we will take up this topic and related topics, inshallah, in our next video. So until then, we'll see you next time. Assalamu alaikum, and thank you very much.